Okay, so once you're logged into the console, let's go to domain structure, and under domain structure, go ahead and expand services and click on data sources. So this is where we're going to create our data source. So go ahead and click new, and then you can see here you've got the three data source types that you can create. We've got generic, grid link, which is used for configuring Oracle RAC, and multi-data source. So go ahead and select generic data source, and this is where we configure the data source. So in the lab, take a look at the table at the beginning of the lab. I believe it's table number 8, data source properties, and create the data source according to the parameters and values in that table. So the name of our data source is merely a logical name. It does need to be unique. So you can't have data source names or any resource of the same name. So let's go ahead and specify the name of our data source, which I'm going to call Derby DS, and the JNDI name. The JNDI name is what the application will use to locate the data source in the JNDI tree. So we're going to use demo.derbyds. And then under database type, there should be a Derby entry. So go ahead and select that and click Next. On the JDBC drivers page, you can see that there's an XA driver, there's an embedded driver, and there's a non-XA driver. So go ahead and pick the third option, the Derby's driver type 4, and click Next. So on the transactions option page, we can select or configure how we want this driver to support transactions. If you remember in the lecture, I talked about XA and non-XA drivers. We just selected a non-XA JDBC driver. WebLogic defaults to supporting global transactions, and then there are 3 different protocols. So in order to support global transactions, we can configure one of these 3 options: logging last resource, emulating a 2-phase commit, or a 1-phase commit. So Oracle recommends configuring logging last resource over emulating a 2-phase commit if this data source is going to be part of a global transaction. So let's go ahead and accept the defaults. We're not going to actually use this data source to do anything at this point in time. We're not going to deploy an application that requires the use of global transactions or 2-phase commit. So let's accept the defaults here and click Next. And this page defines the connection properties for the JDBC driver. So for database name, go ahead and enter the name of the database. This is the one that we just created called DemoDB. The host name of the database server. So right now it's running on the same machine as WebLogic. So I'm just going to put localhost in here. 1527 is the default port. We did not change that. And we did not define a username and password for the database. So go ahead and leave these blank and then click Next. So on this page, the test database connection page, we can actually test the database connection. So look over this page and you'll see that the first parameter here is driver class name. This is the Java class name for the JDBC driver. And the URL is the JDBC connection URL. You can see that WebLogic automatically determines that based on the values that you entered on the previous screen. Okay. And since we did not define a username or password for this database, the database username and password is blank. Typically, when you create a database, you create a database user and password to allow access to that database. In this case, we didn't do that, so just leave these values blank. So if I scroll down a little bit, you can see there's a properties text box here. These properties are JDBC properties. So a lot of times JDBC drivers support defining JDBC standard properties or custom properties, and you can do that here in this text box. In this last text box, this test table name, WebLogic generates a SQL statement that you can use to run tests against your database to see if it's up. So go ahead and click the test configuration button. WebLogic will connect to the database and run that SQL statement. If that SQL statement were to fail, then our test would fail, and you would see that up here. So you can see that our connection test was succeeded. So go ahead and click Next. Now we need to target our data source. It's not enough to create the data source. We now need to tell WebLogic where this data source is going to live. So in a previous lab, we created a managed server, MS1, and we have our admin server. So for the lab, let's go ahead and just deploy this to the admin server. So what this means is that the data source will only be available on the admin server and not managed server 1. Now, if I had an application deployed to managed server 1, I could do a remote JNDI lookup for the data source that's running on the admin server. But typically in a Java EE application, when an application looks up a resource, it does not do a remote lookup. It's looking up resources locally. So it's expecting that the data source is available on managed server 1's local JNDI tree, and it's not trying to connect to a remote JNDI tree. However, that is technically possible. But we're not doing any sort of application testing against data sources, so just go ahead and pick admin server and click finish. And so you should see a message here that all changes have been activated, no restarts are necessary. So that means that our data source has been created. You can see that here, Derby DS, and it tells you the type and the JNDI name and where it's been targeted. So you can monitor this data source by go ahead and clicking on the monitoring tab. In the monitoring tab, we'll list all the data sources in your domain and give some information about the number of active connections. You can customize this table to include additional information. So if I click on customize this table, you can see here under available all the various attributes that I can monitor. So we can take a look at the JDBC driver, current capacity for the connection pool, total connection count, current capacity. Let's go ahead and add connection total count. So check that box and add it to our list and go ahead and click apply. And let me move this over a little bit so I can expand the window. And you can see that connections total count now appears in our monitoring table. And you can see that there's been one total connection to the data source. And that one total connection came from when we tested the data source. So go ahead and click on the Derby DS here. And when we click on Derby DS, it takes us to the settings portion for this data source. And if you look at the top here, we've got various tabs. We've got configuration. Let's go ahead and click on that. And this provides the general configuration for the data source. So on this page, we can see the JNDI name. If we click on the connection pool tab, the connection pool describes how to connect to that database. So you can see the JDBC URL, the JDBC driver class name, and the properties that WebLogic generated for us. You can also add encrypted properties. So you can actually specify, now there's a separate password field here, but you could specify username and password as a JDBC property. However, you wouldn't want that in the properties text box above because it would appear in plain text. We would want the username and password to be encrypted. So you can do that by adding them to this encrypted properties box. And not just username and password, any properties that you don't want anyone to see, you could add them as encrypted properties here. So another important thing I wanted to mention are these capacity configuration parameters. So these capacity parameters define how large the connection pool gets, the number of physical connections to create. So the initial capacity parameter defines how many database connections are created when the data source is initialized. So when the WebLogic server starts up, it'll create the database connections for the data source. The default here is that only one database connection gets created. And then there's a maximum capacity. which defines the maximum number of database connections that'll get created. So in this case, it's 15. So once 15 connections are in use by an application, no more database connections will be allowed or created. And then there's minimum capacity, which defines the minimum number of database connections that can be created after the data source has been initialized. So you can tune these parameters, you can modify these parameters to tune performance as it relates to a database and WebLogic. So what I like to do is set my initial maximum and minimum capacity to be about the same. So I'm going to make them all 15 here. And what that means is that when WebLogic server starts up, all the database connections will be created at that time. And so that can improve performance so that when an application needs a connection, it won't have to create the connection. All the connections are already available. And so that when an application just simply reserves that connection and uses it, the connection's already created. Whereas if initial capacity is set to 1 and my maximum capacity is set to 15, anytime an application would request a connection, WebLogic would have to create that connection. So there's overhead in creating connections. And the question is whether or not you want to incur that overhead when you start up WebLogic, or you want to incur the overhead when your application runs. So go ahead and click Save to save these changes. Let's make this window a little bit smaller. So go ahead and click on the Monitoring tab again. And the Monitoring tab for the data source itself just tells you the state of the data source and the server that it's running on. So in this case, we only targeted the data source to the admin server. It's enabled and it's running. We can test the data source at any time by selecting a server that it's targeted to and clicking the Test Data Source button, and that should work. So click on the Control tab, and on the Control tab, you can actually start up and shut down and reset data sources. So if I wanted to take a data source offline, I could do that. I could suspend it, I could shut it down, I can reset it, which resets all the database connections in the data source. Let's go ahead and restart it. Let's do a shutdown, hit yes. So this data source is shut down. Now if I click on the Monitoring tab, we can see on the Testing subtab that the data source is shut down on the admin server. So if I check the box and click Test Data Source, we should get a Connection Test Failed message. Go and click on the Control tab again and turn it back on. And check the box and click Start. So now the data source is up and running. So let's go back and click on Data Sources under the Domain Structure Services, and then click on the Monitoring tab and take a look at the data source runtime statistics table. I'm going to slide this over here for a second. And notice the total number of connections is 30. This is over the lifetime of the data source. And that's it. So you've successfully created a data source using a Derby database, and I've shown you how to configure that data source using connection properties and the various different transaction options that are available. And we've also taken a look at how to monitor the data source and how to stop and restart that data source.